The wind coming off Lake Michigan that night felt like it was made of broken glass. It was a classic Chicago winter evening, the kind where the cold doesn't just hit your skin, it sinks straight into your bones. The city streets below were a blur of yellow headlights and swirling snow, but high above it all, inside the towering glass monolith of Vanguard Innovations, the temperature was perfectly artificially controlled. It was quiet. The kind of heavy, expensive quiet that only exists on the executive floors of billion-dollar empires after everyone else has gone home. Now let me tell you about Chloe Davis. Chloe was 20 years old, a young black woman who had just started her internship at Vanguard that very week. If you looked at her, the first thing you'd notice was her hair, thick, dark curls pulled back into a tight, no-nonsense bun at the nape of her neck. It was the hairstyle of someone who didn't have time to mess around. She had striking, intelligent eyes, but they carried a heavy exhaustion, the kind of deep tiredness you usually only see on people twice her age. Chloe wasn't born into privilege. Her mother had passed away when she was young, leaving her proud, hard-working father to raise her and her little brother. But a few months ago, her father's heart gave out. Now he was tethered to a hospital bed, and the medical bills were piling up like a nightmare you can't wake up from. Adding to that was her brother's upcoming college tuition. Chloe was drowning, but she was a fighter. She wore a neat but clearly second-hand blazer, and on her feet were a pair of worn-out canvas sneakers, the soles smoothed down from miles of walking to save on bus fare. It was a Friday night, and Chloe had stayed late. First-week interns usually just want to impress their bosses, but Chloe was desperately trying to finish a massive data entry task, hoping it might lead to some paid overtime. Sometime around 9 o'clock, she was asked by a mid-level manager to drop a confidential file box off at the secure archives. But Vanguard's headquarters was a labyrinth of glass and steel. Taking a wrong turn coming out of the elevator, she found herself wandering down a dimly lit, silent corridor. She didn't realize it, but she had accidentally swiped her temporary access card on a service elevator that took her straight to the top floor, the penthouse level, the domain of the CEO. The hallway was lined with dark mahogany and modern art. Chloe walked slowly, her worn-out sneakers sinking deeply into the incredibly thick, hand-tufted wool rug. The contrast was almost painful, her cheap, fraying shoes pressing into a floor covering that probably cost more than her father's entire medical debt. She approached a set of heavy double doors that had been left slightly ajar. Assuming it was the archive room, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. It wasn't the archive. It was a corner office, massive and imposing, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering, frozen sprawl of Chicago. This was the office of Julian Vance. Julian Vance was 32 years old and already a legend in the tech world. If you saw a picture of him in a magazine, you'd see a man with sharp, almost predatory features, dark hair kept meticulously neat, and eyes that were the exact color of winter ice. He was known as a machine. Julian didn't have friends. He had assets and liabilities. Growing up in a wealthy but entirely loveless family, he learned early on that trust was a weakness. He built Vanguard Innovations with a ruthless, calculating precision. He was cold, intimidating, and completely unforgiving of mistakes. Chloe stood in the center of his office, clutching her file box, her eyes wide as she took in the minimalist, expensive leather furniture and the massive oak desk. And then she saw it. Behind the desk, a modern painting had been swung open on its hinges, revealing a steel wall safe. The heavy metal door of the safe was slightly ajar. Chloe took a tentative step closer, her breath catching in her throat. Inside the safe, bathed in the faint security light, were stacks of $100 bills. Not just a few, dozens of thick, neatly banded stacks of raw cash. It was more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. In the dead silence of that massive office, a sudden, sharp vibration echoed loudly. It was coming from Chloe's cheap coat pocket. Her phone was buzzing. She didn't need to look at the screen to know what it was. It was the automated daily text message from the hospital's billing department, a cruel, robotic reminder that her father's account was severely past due. If she didn't make a payment by Monday, they were going to move him to a lower-care public ward, which, in his fragile state, could be a death sentence. And then there was her brother, who had called her crying yesterday because he might be dropped from his classes. Chloe stared at the stacks of cash. Her heart began to pound, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The temptation was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Just one stack, just one of those thick bands of hundreds would pay off the hospital. It would save her father. It would keep her brother in school. A billionaire like Julian Vance wouldn't even notice it was gone. Who leaves a safe open anyway? It felt like a sick twist of fate, a lifeline thrown to her in the darkest moment of her life. Slowly, almost against her own will, Chloe raised her right hand. Her fingers trembled violently as she reached out toward the open steel door. She was inches away from the money. The green edges of the bills seemed to mock her desperation. But then she stopped. Her hand hovered in the cold air. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness of her mind, she heard her father's voice. He was a proud man who had worked his hands to the bone as a mechanic. He used to tell her, "Chloe, the only thing in this world that truly belongs to you is your character. Once you sell it, you can never buy it back." A tear slipped down Chloe's cheek, catching the faint light from the window. She couldn't do it. She couldn't save her father by becoming a thief. It would break his heart worse than his illness ever could. With a sharp intake of breath, Chloe pulled her hand back as if the money had burned her. She wiped her face, stepping forward not to steal, but to grab the heavy steel handle of the safe. With a firm, decisive push, she swung the safe door shut. It locked with a heavy, solid click. Without looking back, Chloe turned around, her worn sneakers moving quickly across the expensive rug. She slipped out of the office, pulling the heavy double doors completely shut behind her, disappearing back into the labyrinth of the building. What Chloe Davis did not know was that she had not been alone. Through a two-way mirror connecting the office to a private, darkened lounge, Julian Vance stood perfectly still. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, holding a glass of scotch that he hadn't taken a sip from in 10 minutes. His icy eyes tracked Chloe's every movement. He had watched her enter, watched her stare at the money, watched her reach out, and, with a flicker of genuine surprise, watched her close the safe and walk away. Julian hadn't left the safe open by accident. Julian Vance didn't make mistakes. The open safe was a highly calculated trap, but it wasn't meant for a 20-year-old intern. It was meant for Marcus Thorne. Marcus Thorne was Vanguard's chief financial officer. He was a man in his late 40s with distinguished silver hair, a permanent charismatic smile, and a taste for custom Italian suits. To the board of directors, Marcus was a financial genius, but Julian had recently uncovered discrepancies. Marcus was greedy, and he was secretly embezzling massive amounts from the company's internal emergency funds. Julian had set the trap that evening. He knew Marcus would be working late on the executive floor. He had purposely withdrawn the cash, left the safe ajar, and leaked a fake schedule showing he had left the building. But the money inside that safe wasn't just cash. Every single $100 bill had been meticulously dusted with a microscopic, chemically traceable fluorescent powder. Once you touched it, the invisible powder would bind to your skin and clothing, impossible to wash off completely. and it would glow blindingly bright under ultraviolet light. Julian had been waiting in the dark to catch his CFO red-handed. Chloe's appearance had been a complete anomaly, a glitch in his perfect system. Julian stepped out from the darkened lounge into his main office. He walked over to the safe, running a hand along the polished wood of his desk. He thought about the girl in the worn-out sneakers. He had seen the absolute desperation in her eyes, the violent trembling of her hand. She needed that money as if her life depended on it. Yet she had walked away. In a corporate world built on greed, lies, and betrayal, Julian Vance had just witnessed something he thought went extinct a long time ago: pure, uncorrupted integrity. Julian pulled his phone from his pocket and accessed the building's security system. He pulled up the personnel file of the girl who had just left his office. Her face appeared on his screen. Chloe Davis, first-year intern. Julian's cold eyes narrowed slightly. The trap for Marcus Thorne was still in play, but suddenly the game had become infinitely more interesting. The morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Vanguard Innovations offered no warmth, casting long, sharp shadows across the penthouse office. Julian Vance sat perfectly still behind his massive oak desk, the only sound in the room being the faint, rhythmic clicking of his mouse. He was replaying the security footage from the hidden camera positioned just above the safe. He had watched the clip a dozen times since he arrived at dawn, yet the anomaly of it still captivated his calculating mind. On the high-definition monitor, a 20-year-old intern named Chloe Davis stood frozen before stacks of $100 bills. Julian leaned closer, his icy blue eyes fixed on her hands. He watched as her fingers extended, hovering mere inches from the cash, trembling so violently they seemed to vibrate with the sheer force of her desperation. It was the raw, unfiltered physical manifestation of a person fighting for survival. Then came the moment of divergence. She didn't take it. She withdrew her hand, wiped a single tear from her cheek, and decisively slammed the heavy steel door shut. As the safe clicked, locked on the screen, a strange, unfamiliar sensation rippled through Julian. The cold, mechanical detachment that usually governed his gaze wavered. His eyes, typically sharp and unforgiving, softened for just a fraction of a second. In a world where loyalty was bought and morality was a line item on a balance sheet, this girl with worn-out canvas sneakers had defied human nature. But Julian was not a man who operated on sentiment. Integrity was useless if it wasn't backed by competence. He needed to know if Chloe Davis was merely an honest fool or if her intellect matched her character. He picked up his desk phone and pressed a single button. Down on the 42nd floor, the intern bullpen was a chaotic hive of ringing phones, clacking keyboards, and the nervous chatter of ambitious college students. Chloe sat at her cramped cubicle, her stomach tied in excruciating knots. She hadn't slept a wink. Every time the elevator chimed, her heart leapt into her throat. She was terrified, absolutely convinced that the building's security team was going to march down the aisle, pack up her meager belongings, and drag her out in handcuffs for trespassing in the CEO's office. She stared blankly at her computer screen, the numbers blurring together as she waited for the inevitable axe to fall. The sharp clack of heels cutting through the bullpen chatter made her freeze. Standing at the edge of her cubicle was Ms. Eleanor Sterling. Eleanor was Julian Vance's executive assistant, a woman in her mid-50s who moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a phantom. She wore a tailored tweed skirt suit, her sharp features framed by silver-rimmed glasses resting on a patrician nose. She was fiercely protective of Julian's time and notoriously intolerant of incompetence. Eleanor looked down at Chloe, her expression unreadable. "Miss Davis," Eleanor said, her voice crisp and echoing slightly in the sudden silence of the surrounding cubicles. "Mr. Vance requires your presence in his office. Immediately." Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. This was it. She nodded wordlessly, grabbing her notepad with shaking hands, and followed the terrifyingly poised assistant to the executive elevator. When Chloe stepped into the penthouse office, the sheer scale of it was just as intimidating in the daylight. Julian Vance did not look up from his monitors as she approached. He was a portrait of corporate ruthlessness, his dark hair immaculate, his posture perfectly rigid in his leather chair. "Sit," he commanded softly. Chloe perched on the very edge of one of the expensive guest chairs, her worn sneakers tucked nervously beneath her. She braced herself for the firing, the threats, the police. Instead, Julian casually pushed a massive 6-inch thick binder across the polished mahogany desk. It landed in front of her with a heavy thud. "This," Julian began, his voice devoid of any emotion, "is the complete financial ledger and income expense report for Project Apex. It is the most capital-intensive venture Vanguard has launched this decade." Chloe stared at the binder, her mind racing. "Sir, I'm just a first-week intern. I was doing data entry on the fourth-quarter micro-accounts." Julian finally looked up, pinning her with his piercing gaze. He made absolutely no mention of the open safe the night before, or her trespassing. "I am aware of your title, Miss Davis. I am not interested in your job description. I am interested in your analytical capacity. The accounting firm has already cleared this report, but I want a fresh, completely unbiased set of eyes on it. You will review every line item, every expense, every projected margin. I expect a preliminary analysis on my desk by the end of the week." Chloe was utterly stunned. This was an assignment meant for senior analysts, not a 20-year-old college student. It was a monumental task, completely above her pay grade. But as she looked at the binder, she didn't see an impossible burden. She saw a lifeline, a chance to prove her worth, to secure a paid position, to save her family. "I won't let you down, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice steadying as determination replaced her fear. Julian simply gave a curt nod, dismissing her. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Vanguard cafeteria was bustling with executives enjoying artisanal salads and sushi, the air filled with the scent of expensive coffee. Chloe, however, bypassed the cafeteria entirely. She sat alone on a quiet bench in a secluded glass skywalk connecting the two main towers. She opened her worn plastic lunch container to reveal 2 slices of dry, unbuttered bread. There was no meat, no cheese, no vibrant vegetables. She took a slow bite, chewing the tasteless, tough bread mechanically. She had to save every single penny she could scrape together. The few dollars she would have spent on a cafeteria lunch were already mentally allocated to her father's towering medical debts. As she swallowed the dry meal, she balanced the heavy Project Apex binder on her lap, her eyes scanning complex financial derivatives and multi-million-dollar vendor payouts. The cruel irony of reading about tens of millions of dollars while forcing down dry bread to stave off hunger was not lost on her, but it only sharpened her focus. She traced the numbers with her pencil, her brilliant mind beginning to decipher the intricate language of corporate finance. Unbeknownst to Chloe, she was being watched. From the second-floor mezzanine overlooking the skywalk, Marcus Thorne stood nursing a double espresso. Marcus was Vanguard's chief financial officer, a man in his late 40s who exuded an aura of manufactured charm. He possessed impeccably groomed silver hair, a bright, charismatic smile that never quite reached his cold eyes, and a bespoke Italian suit that draped perfectly over his frame. To the outside world, Marcus was the brilliant architect of Vanguard's fiscal health. In reality, he was deeply arrogant, relentlessly paranoid, and currently siphoning millions from the company's internal emergency funds. Marcus narrowed his eyes as he recognized the thick, red-spined binder resting on the lap of the young black girl eating dry bread. He knew exactly what that binder was. It was the Project Apex financials, the very project he had been quietly manipulating to cover up his embezzlement tracks. Marcus beckoned a passing junior manager. "Who is that?" Marcus asked smoothly, his voice a low, cultured purr, gesturing subtly toward the skywalk. The manager squinted. "Oh, that's Chloe Davis, a new intern. Strangely, the CEO's office requested her file this morning and handed her that project." The manager scurried away, leaving Marcus alone with a sudden, spiking surge of adrenaline. His charismatic facade slipped, revealing the tense, calculating predator beneath. Julian Vance was a notoriously paranoid CEO. Why would he bypass the entire financial department and hand a highly sensitive, potentially compromised ledger to a nobody intern? Marcus's mind raced, connecting invisible dots. Had Julian noticed the discrepancies? Was this girl a spy? No, that was ridiculous. She was just a desperate kid. But the vulnerability of his scheme was suddenly glaring. If this intern stumbled upon the shell companies he had buried in the Apex vendor lists, his entire life would collapse. He would lose his penthouses, his sports cars, his freedom. A dark, venomous plan began to form in Marcus's mind. He needed a contingency. He needed a firewall. If the missing funds were discovered, the blame could not fall on the CFO. It needed to fall on someone expendable, someone who had access to the files, someone who was visibly desperate for money, someone the board would easily believe had manipulated the data for personal gain. He watched Chloe take another bite of her dry bread, her worn sneakers shifting against the floor. She was perfect. She was poor, she was isolated, and Julian had just foolishly handed her the very documents that could be used to frame her. Marcus smoothed the lapels of his suit, his charismatic smile returning, sharper and more dangerous than before. He would use his absolute authority to weave a web of digital evidence around Chloe Davis. He would turn the CEO's little experiment into the perfect scapegoat, completely unaware that Julian Vance was already playing a much larger, far more lethal game. Outside the reinforced glass windows of Vanguard Innovations, a brutal Chicago blizzard had descended. The heavy, relentless snow swirled in chaotic, blinding sheets, burying the city streets under a thick blanket of white. The storm raged against the glass, a chaotic reflection of the suffocating tension currently building inside the towering corporate monolith. On the 42nd floor, the intern bullpen was deserted, save for the single pool of fluorescent light illuminating Chloe Davis's cubicle. It was 6 a.m. Chloe had been at her desk since the building opened, her eyes red-rimmed from another sleepless night. The thick, red-spined binder of Project Apex lay open before her, completely covered in a chaotic web of yellow highlighters, sticky notes, and frantic pencil scribbles. What began as a terrifying test of her analytical skills had slowly morphed into a horrifying realization. The numbers did not add up. At first glance, the ledger was a masterpiece of corporate accounting, perfectly balanced to the decimal. But Chloe possessed a rare, instinctual mathematical brilliance, a gift she had honed, balancing her father's impossibly tight household budgets. She traced the massive expenditures, consulting fees, international logistics, software licensing, and noticed a pattern. Millions of dollars were being funneled into 3 specific offshore LLCs. On paper, they were listed as primary vendors for Project Apex. But when Chloe cross-referenced the tax identification numbers with the public commercial registries she had scraped from the internet, She found nothing. No physical addresses, no board members, no legitimate service records. They were phantom companies, shells designed to absorb Vanguard's capital and vanish. A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck. She was just a first-week intern, a 20-year-old college student wearing second-hand clothes. She was looking at a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme orchestrated at the highest levels of the company. Exposing this could not only cost her the internship, her only lifeline to save her dying father, but it could put a target on her back. The corporate executives involved would undoubtedly crush her. But as she stared at the fabricated numbers, her father's voice echoed in her mind once again. Integrity is the only thing you truly own. She couldn't look away. She gathered the files, her hands trembling, and made a decision that could end her career before it even started. While Chloe was deep in the labyrinth of financial documents, a much darker game was being played on the 51st floor. The server room was a chillingly cold, sterile environment, bathed in the blue glow of massive data racks. Marcus Thorne moved through the humming aisles with the sleek, predatory grace of a man who believed he was entirely untouchable. He was not alone. Sitting at the master control terminal was David Rossi. David was a 24-year-old junior systems administrator, a scrawny, chronically sleep-deprived young man with thick-rimmed glasses, a terrible posture, and a nervous habit of chewing his thumbnails down to the quick. He was brilliant with code, but socially terrified, easily bullied by the sharp-suited executives who roamed the upper floors. "Mr. Thorne, sir?" David stammered, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. "I really shouldn't be granting you back-end access to an employee's terminal without a logged request from Human Resources. It's against IT protocol." Marcus rested a heavy, perfectly manicured hand on the young man's bony shoulder, squeezing just hard enough to convey a threat. "David, my boy," Marcus purred, his charismatic smile completely devoid of warmth. "This is a highly sensitive, Level 1 financial audit. If you prefer to halt an executive investigation over a minor bureaucratic protocol, I can certainly arrange a meeting with your department head to discuss your lack of cooperation." David swallowed hard, his face paling. "No, sir, I understand." With trembling fingers, he bypassed the security firewalls, granting Marcus full remote access to Chloe Davis's workstation. "Excellent. Take a 15-minute coffee break, David," Marcus commanded. As the terrified tech scurried out of the freezing room, Marcus took his seat. With rapid, practiced strokes, he began planting a series of sophisticated encrypted emails directly onto Chloe's hard drive. The fabricated messages detailed communications between Chloe and the Phantom offshore LLCs, creating a digital paper trail that made the 20-year-old intern look like a criminal mastermind siphoning Vanguard's funds. But digital evidence was not enough for Marcus. He needed something tangible, something damning. Earlier that morning, just before dawn, Marcus had slipped into Julian Vance's penthouse office. Using his executive override code, he had accessed the CEO's wall safe and hurriedly stuffed several thick stacks of $100 bills into his briefcase. He was completely unaware that every single bill he touched was heavily dusted with a microscopic, chemically traceable fluorescent powder that was now deeply embedded in the pores of his hands and the expensive fabric of his suit. Leaving the server room, Marcus took the service elevator down to the employee locker room. It was empty. He easily picked the cheap padlock on locker number 402, Chloe's locker. Inside hung her faded winter coat and a worn canvas backpack. Marcus unzipped the front pocket of her backpack and shoved one of the stolen, tightly banded stacks of $100 bills deep inside. He zipped it shut, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. The trap was set. The poor, desperate intern was about to take the fall for everything. Oblivious to the digital and physical snare closing around her, Chloe stood before the heavy double doors of the penthouse office. She took a deep, shuddering breath, clutching the binder to her chest like a shield, and knocked. "Enter," came the cold, resonant voice from within. Chloe stepped into the massive office. Behind the vast expanse of the floor-to-ceiling windows, the blizzard raged, the white snow creating a stark, dramatic backdrop. Julian Vance stood near the glass, a silhouette of absolute corporate power, watching the storm. He turned slowly as she approached, his icy blue eyes locking onto hers. "Miss Davis, it is Thursday morning. I expected your preliminary report by Friday." "I found something, Mr. Vance," Chloe said. Her voice shook on the first syllable, but as she stepped forward and dropped the heavy binder onto his mahogany desk, a sudden, fierce resolve washed over her. She opened the folder, revealing her chaotic web of highlighters and notes. The accounting firm that cleared this report only verified the arithmetic. They didn't verify the entities. Julian walked slowly to his desk, his expression unreadable. "Explain?" Chloe pointed to the highlighted lines. $32 million over the last 2 quarters have been allocated to 3 primary logistical vendors for Project Apex, but these vendors don't exist, sir. I pulled their tax IDs and cross-referenced them with state commercial registries. They have no physical footprint, no operational history, and no payroll taxes. They are shell companies. Someone with high-level executive clearance is intentionally burying unauthorized capital transfers inside the Apex ledger. Millions of dollars are being stolen from Vanguard. The silence in the massive office was deafening. The only sound was the muffled howling of the blizzard against the glass. Chloe stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, waiting for the CEO to dismiss her, to call security, or to accuse her of insubordination. Julian Vance looked down at the meticulously researched notes, tracing her brilliant, undeniable logic. He then looked up at the young woman in the second-hand blazer. She was terrified, yet she stood her ground, looking him directly in the eye. In a building filled with highly paid executives, too cowardly to speak the truth, this desperate intern had risked everything to do the right thing. Slowly, the rigid, icy lines of Julian's face began to soften. The corners of his mouth twitched, and for the first time since Chloe had met him, Julian Vance smiled. It was a faint, remarkably rare expression, but it transformed his predatory features into something startlingly human. "You are incredibly observant, Miss Davis," Julian said softly, his voice losing its usual sharp edge. "But you are not the first to notice this anomaly." Chloe blinked, completely taken aback. You already knew?" Julian's smile faded, replaced by a look of sharp, calculated intensity. "I know exactly who is stealing from my company, and I know exactly what he is doing right now to try and cover his tracks." He leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "You have proven your intellect, Chloe, but more importantly, you have proven your courage. Now, I need to know if you are brave enough to help me catch a thief." The silence in the penthouse office felt heavy, charged with a sudden shifting dynamic. Julian Vance remained standing behind his mahogany desk, his icy blue eyes fixed on the young intern who had just unraveled a multi-million-dollar corporate conspiracy. Chloe Davis stood frozen, the thick Project Apex binder acting as a fragile shield against her chest. She had expected to be fired, perhaps even threatened, but the faint, almost imperceptible smile that had just graced the CEO's lips completely disarmed her. "Help you catch a thief?" Chloe repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Vance, I'm just an intern. If someone at the executive level is doing this, they will crush me." Julian walked slowly around the desk, closing the distance between them. "They will certainly try," he said, his tone remarkably calm. "Because the man orchestrating this is Marcus Thorne, our chief financial officer." Chloe gasped softly, taking an instinctive step back. Marcus was practically vanguard royalty, a man whose tailored suits and charismatic smiles masked a deeply ruthless ambition. "I have suspected Marcus for months," Julian continued, turning to look out at the raging Chicago blizzard. "But he is exceptionally careful. He covers his digital tracks impeccably. So I had to create a scenario where he would make a physical mistake, a trap." Julian turned back to her, his gaze intense. "Last Friday night, the safe behind my desk was left open. Inside was a substantial amount of cash. Every single $100 bill was meticulously dusted with a microscopic, chemically traceable fluorescent powder. Once touched, it binds to the skin and fabric, glowing brilliantly under ultraviolet light. I was waiting in the adjacent lounge for Marcus to take the bait." Julian paused, his eyes softening slightly. "But Marcus didn't walk through those doors. You did." Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. Her mind raced back to that terrifying night, the agonizing temptation, the buzzing of the hospital's billing department in her pocket. You were watching me?" "I watched you fight a war within yourself, Chloe," Julian said softly. "I saw the desperation. I know about your father's medical bills. I know about your brother's tuition. You were drowning, and you had a lifeline right in front of you. Yet you closed the door and walked away." He stepped closer, his imposing presence suddenly feeling protective rather than intimidating. "Integrity is easy when you have millions in the bank. True character is tested when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. You passed a test you didn't even know you were taking, but Marcus took the bait early this morning." Chloe's eyes widened in realization. "If he took the marked money, then you have him. Why do you need me?" "Because Marcus is a cornered animal, and cornered animals lash out," Julian explained, his voice hardening back into its usual commanding cadence. "He knows the audit is closing in. He saw you with the Apex files today. Right now, he is undoubtedly using his security clearance to plant fabricated evidence on your computer, and perhaps even physical evidence in your belongings. Tomorrow, at 10 o'clock, I am convening an emergency meeting of the board of directors. Marcus will use that stage to publicly expose you as the mastermind behind the missing funds, playing the hero who caught the corrupt intern." "You want me to let him accuse me?" Chloe asked, panic rising in her chest. "I want you to be the perfect bait," Julian corrected. "I need you in that boardroom tomorrow. When he attacks, I need you to play the role of the terrified, guilty, cornered victim. Let him lay out all his fabricated evidence. Let him feel absolute victory. Only when he is entirely committed, completely arrogant in his success, will I spring the final trap. Will you do this, Chloe? Will you trust me?" Chloe looked into Julian's eyes. Behind the cold billionaire facade, she saw a man who actually believed in her. She thought of her father, of the values he had instilled in her. She tightened her grip on the binder and gave a firm, resolute nod. "I'll do it." Meanwhile, several floors below, Marcus Thorne was indeed finalizing his masterpiece of deception. Sitting in his lavishly appointed corner office, Marcus picked up his encrypted cell phone and dialed a direct line to the Chicago Police Department's Economic Crimes Division. The phone was answered on the second ring by Captain Gregory Miller. Miller was a 50-year-old no-nonsense veteran of the force. He was a burly man with a perpetually furrowed brow, a thick grey moustache, and a deep-seated hatred for white-collar criminals who hid behind expensive lawyers. However, Miller had cultivated a mutually beneficial relationship with Vanguard over the years, relying on their corporate security tips to make high-profile arrests. "Captain Miller, this is Marcus Thorne," the CFO purred smoothly, projecting an aura of grave disappointment. "Mr. Thorne, what can I do for Vanguard today?" Miller's gravelly voice crackled over the line. "I'm afraid I have uncovered a rather devastating internal breach," Marcus said, sighing heavily for dramatic effect. "A temporary intern has managed to bypass our secondary financial protocols and has been siphoning funds into offshore shell accounts. I have secured digital evidence, and I believe she has stolen cash hidden on the premises." "An intern, bold kid," Miller grunted. "You want my boys to quietly escort her out?" "No," Marcus replied sharply. "I am presenting my findings to the board of directors tomorrow at 10. I want you and your officers waiting in the executive lobby. When I give the signal, I want her arrested publicly. Vanguard needs to send a clear message that internal theft will be met with absolute, uncompromising justice." "We'll be there, Thorne. 10 a.m. sharp," Miller confirmed, before hanging up. Marcus smiled, tossing the phone onto his desk. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, sipping a glass of aged scotch. The plan was flawless. By tomorrow afternoon, Chloe Davis would be in a holding cell, and Marcus would be hailed as the savior of Vanguard's finances. Up in the penthouse, after Chloe had safely left the building, Julian Vance sat alone in the quiet dimness of his office. He pulled out a private, untraceable phone and dialed a number he rarely used. It was the direct personal line of Dr. Harrison Croft, the chief of surgery at Chicago Memorial Hospital. Dr. Croft was a brilliant, perpetually exhausted man in his late 50s, known for his extraordinary surgical skills and his endless frustration with hospital bureaucracy. He and Julian had crossed paths years ago when Vanguard had funded a massive new research wing. "Julian," Dr. Croft answered, sounding surprised. "It's late. What does Vanguard need this time?" "Harrison, I need a personal favor, and I need it done quietly and immediately," Julian said, his tone brokering no argument. "You have a patient in your cardiac ward, a Mr. Arthur Davis. He is critically past due on his accounts and is scheduled to be moved to a public ward." There was a pause on the line as Dr. Croft tapped on his keyboard. "Yes, I see the file. His heart condition is deteriorating rapidly. He needs a highly specialized valve replacement, but his insurance is exhausted. It's a tragedy, Julian, but my hands are tied by the hospital board." "Consider the board bypassed," Julian stated flatly. "I am wiring $250,000 into the hospital's anonymous donor trust right now. It is specifically earmarked for Arthur Davis. I want his debt wiped clean, I want him in a VIP recovery suite, and I want you performing that valve replacement tomorrow." Dr. Croft let out a low whistle. "Done. I'll prep the surgical team tonight." "One more thing," Julian added. "His daughter cannot know this came from me. Just tell her an anonymous charity foundation stepped in." Julian hung up before the surgeon could ask any questions. He immediately opened his encrypted laptop and drafted a secure email to the financial aid office of the state university where Chloe's brother was enrolled. Using a dummy corporation Vanguard used for philanthropic tax write-offs, Julian authorized a full-ride, 4-year academic scholarship, effectively immediately. Julian closed the laptop, staring out at the relentless blizzard. He needed Chloe sharp, focused, and entirely unburdened for the performance of her life tomorrow. Fear was a powerful motivator, but Julian knew that true, unshakable courage only came when the people you loved were safe. 2 hours later, Chloe was sitting on the freezing, rattling carriage of the L train, heading back to her cramped apartment in the South Side. The adrenaline of the day was wearing off, leaving her bone-tired and terrified of what tomorrow would bring. Suddenly her cheap cell phone buzzed. She winced, expecting another automated collection threat. But the caller ID read, Chicago Memorial, Chief of Surgery. Her heart stopped. She answered with trembling hands. "Hello?" The Vanguard Innovations executive boardroom on the 50th floor was a monument to corporate intimidation. Enclosed by soundproof floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the snow-battered Chicago skyline, the room was dominated by a massive, polished mahogany table that seemed to stretch on for miles. At exactly 10 o'clock, the atmosphere inside was thick enough to suffocate. Sitting near the head of the table was Arthur Pendleton, the senior board member. Arthur was a man in his late 70s, possessing the sharp, calculating eyes of a starving vulture and a rigid posture that refused to yield to age. Having built his vast fortune in the ruthless world of corporate acquisitions during the 80s, Arthur's tolerance for financial discrepancy was famously non-existent. A single scowl from him was usually enough to end careers. Today, his scowl was directed toward the center of the room. Chloe Davis sat in a solitary leather chair positioned opposite the board. She looked incredibly small in her faded second-hand blazer. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her shoulders hunched, and her eyes wide with what appeared to be absolute, paralyzing terror. She was trembling visibly. To anyone watching, she looked exactly like a guilty, cornered thief whose world was crashing down. In reality, the tremor in her hands was pure adrenaline, and beneath her frightened facade burned the fierce, unshakable resolve Julian had ignited in her the previous day. Standing a few feet away, radiating an aura of majestic, sorrowful authority, was Marcus Thorne. The chief financial officer wore a bespoke, midnight blue Italian suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. He commanded the room with the practiced ease of a master conductor leading a symphony. Standing quietly by the heavy oak doors was Captain Gregory Miller of the Economic Crimes Division, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Marcus had brought them here to legitimize his grand performance, fully intending to have the intern hauled away in handcuffs in front of the entire board. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Marcus began, his voice a rich, resonant baritone dripping with manufactured regret. "I called this emergency session because Vanguard Innovations is bleeding. Over the past 2 quarters, I have personally uncovered a highly sophisticated, unauthorized diversion of capital within Project Apex. Millions of dollars have been systematically siphoned into offshore shell corporations." A collective murmur of outrage rippled through the board members. Arthur Pendleton slammed his hand onto the table. "Who authorized this, Thorne? Who is responsible?" Arthur demanded, his voice cracking like a whip. Marcus turned slowly, extending a perfectly manicured hand to point directly at the trembling 20-year-old girl. "The architect of this theft is sitting right in front of you," Marcus declared. "Miss Chloe Davis, a temporary intern who manipulated her low-level data entry clearance to alter our financial ledgers, transferring corporate funds for her own personal enrichment." Chloe shrank back into her chair, whimpering softly, playing her part to absolute perfection. Marcus smiled inwardly, drunk on his own brilliance. He snapped his fingers toward the door. Thomas Hayes, Vanguard's chief of security, stepped forward. Hayes was a towering ex-Marine in his 40s with a shaved head, a thick, muscular neck, and a stoic, unreadable expression. He moved with quiet, lethal efficiency, carrying Chloe's worn canvas backpack. He placed it roughly onto the mahogany table. "Digital evidence is one thing," Marcus purred, unzipping the backpack. but I suspected Miss Davis was also utilizing her late-night hours to steal physical assets from the executive petty cash reserves. Captain Miller, if you would observe." Marcus reached into the frayed bag and dramatically pulled out a thick, tightly banded stack of $100 bills. He tossed it onto the polished wood, where it landed with a heavy, damning thud. The board members gasped. "Caught red-handed," Marcus proclaimed, his charismatic smile now fully visible. "I recommend immediate termination and a maximum criminal prosecution." At the head of the table, sitting perfectly still, was Julian Vance. The CEO had not spoken a single word since the meeting began. He was leaning back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, his posture incredibly relaxed. In his right hand, he held a porcelain cup of black coffee. As Marcus reached the absolute pinnacle of his triumphant arrogance, bathing in the approving nods of the board, Julian slowly raised the cup to his lips and took a deliberate, unhurried sip. The clink of the porcelain, as he set it back onto the saucer, cut through the boardroom chatter like a gunshot. "An impressive narrative, Marcus," Julian said, his voice cold, flat, and echoing with dangerous authority. "Are you absolutely certain this is the undeniable truth? Is this your final statement to this board?" Marcus puffed out his chest, oblivious to the steel trap closing around him. "The evidence is indisputable, Julian. The girl is a thief." Julian stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, and chillingly calm. He picked up a sleek digital tablet from the table and connected a single cable to it. The massive presentation screen behind him hummed to life. "Let us talk about evidence," Julian said softly. He tapped the screen. Suddenly a high-definition video began to play. It was a feed from a hidden camera. The timestamp in the corner read 5:14 a.m. of that very morning. The location was unmistakably Julian's penthouse office. The boardroom fell into a deathly paralyzed silence as the video clearly showed Marcus Thorne sneaking into the darkened office. The board watched in stunned horror as their prestigious CFO bypassed the security keypad, opened the wall safe, and hurriedly stuffed several banded stacks of $100 bills into his leather briefcase. On the screen, Marcus's face was perfectly illuminated by the safe's internal light. There was no ambiguity, there was no denying it. Marcus Thorne froze, the blood completely drained from his face, leaving his immaculate tan looking like grey ash. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The charismatic mask shattered, revealing a terrified, cornered fraud. This is a fabrication, a deep fake," Marcus stammered, his voice pitching high with sudden panic. "Julian, you altered this footage to protect her." Julian took another calm sip of his black coffee, watching Marcus unravel. "I anticipated you might claim digital tampering," Julian replied smoothly. He turned toward the back of the room. "Captain Miller, I believe I informed you earlier this morning about a secondary protocol regarding this cache." Captain Miller, who had been watching the video with a look of mounting disgust, stepped forward. He unclipped a specialized tactical flashlight from his utility belt. "Yes, Mr. Vance, you did." While Marcus had called the police to arrest Chloe, Julian had preemptively contacted Captain Miller an hour before the meeting, presenting him with the undeniable digital proof of Marcus's embezzlement and coordinating this exact moment. "The cash inside my safe," Julian announced to the horrified board, was heavily dusted with a microscopic, chemically active fluorescent powder. It is entirely invisible to the naked eye, but it aggressively binds to human skin and fabric upon contact. Julian gestured to the police captain. "Illuminate him!" Captain Miller flipped the switch on his tactical flashlight, casting a harsh, concentrated beam of ultraviolet light directly onto Marcus Thorne. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Marcus's hands glowed a brilliant, radioactive neon green. The toxic-looking luminescence was smeared across his fingertips, deeply embedded in the pores of his palms, and aggressively transferred onto the expensive lapels of his midnight blue Italian suit, where he had adjusted his jacket. Even the handle of his briefcase, resting near his feet, glowed brightly in the UV light. He looked like a man who had just bathed in radioactive waste. Total chaos erupted in the boardroom. Arthur Pendleton stood up, his face purple with rage, shouting demands for immediate arrest. Marcus stumbled backward, bumping into the table, his glowing hands shaking wildly in the air. "No, listen to me! It's a setup! He trapped me!" Marcus shrieked, the absolute, abject panic in his voice, a pathetic contrast to the icy, unbothered demeanor of the CEO. Julian simply stood there, watching the destruction of the corrupt CFO with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. Captain Miller and his officers moved in swiftly, grabbing Marcus by his glowing arms and forcefully clicking a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. As Marcus was dragged out of the boardroom, shouting and begging, Julian's eyes met Chloe's across the length of the long mahogany table. Chloe had dropped her facade of terror. She sat up straight in her chair, the trembling completely gone. As she watched Marcus Thorne being hauled away to face the justice he had so maliciously tried to force upon her, a profound, overwhelming wave of relief washed over her. The heavy burden of fear that had haunted her for days evaporated. She looked at Julian, the cold, brilliant billionaire who was still casually holding his coffee cup amidst the screaming executives, and saw the faint, approving nod he gave her. Justice had not just been served, it had been masterfully, beautifully executed. The heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom slammed shut, cutting off the frantic, humiliating shouts of Marcus Thorne as Captain Miller and his officers dragged the ruined chief financial officer toward the freight elevator. The toxic green glow of the fluorescent powder on Marcus's hands seemed to burn itself into the memory of every person left standing in the room. Inside the glass-walled sanctuary, the suffocating tension that had gripped the Vanguard Innovations executives instantly dissolved, replaced by a collective, stunned exhalation. Arthur Pendleton, the notoriously ruthless senior board member, sank slowly back into his leather chair, pulling a monogrammed handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his brow. The multi-million-dollar hemorrhage bleeding out of Project Apex had been stopped, and the corporate infection had been surgically, publicly excised. Vanguard's reputation and financial integrity were secure. Amidst the whispered conversations and shocked murmurs of the board, Julian Vance remained a portrait of absolute, unshakable composure. He set his empty porcelain coffee cup down on its saucer with a soft clink, signaling the definitive end of the spectacle. He did not boast, nor did he seek the board's adulation. Instead, his icy blue eyes sought out the young woman sitting alone at the center of the room. Chloe Davis's shoulders had finally dropped from their defensive, terrified hunch. She looked utterly exhausted, yet her brilliant eyes shone with a profound, unburdened lightness. Julian gave her a subtle, dismissive tilt of his head, a silent instruction to leave the vulture's den of the boardroom and wait for him upstairs. By the time the Chicago winter sun began its early descent, casting long, fiery streaks of orange and bruised purple across the frozen surface of Lake Michigan, the 42nd floor Intern bullpen was completely empty. The penthouse office, however, was wrapped in a profound, comfortable silence. Chloe sat on the plush leather sofa in Julian's office, her worn canvas sneakers resting lightly against the expensive rug. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the terrifying confrontation had finally completely faded, leaving behind a surreal sense of peace. She was no longer a terrified college student awaiting the executioner's block. She was a survivor. The heavy mahogany doors pushed open, and Julian walked in. He had discarded his suit jacket and loosened his silk tie, the first sign of casual vulnerability she had ever seen from the intimidating billionaire. He walked over to his massive desk, opened a secure drawer, and pulled out a sleek, black leather folio. Instead of returning to his imposing high-backed chair, Julian crossed the room and sat in the armchair directly across from Chloe, placing the folio on the glass coffee table between them. Before he could speak, the silence was shattered by the sharp, familiar ringing of Chloe's cheap cell phone. She flinched instinctively, conditioned to fear the hospital's automated billing department, but the caller ID flashing on the cracked screen made her breath hitch. It was Aunt Martha. Martha was Chloe's late mother's sister, a sturdy, fiercely loving woman in her late 50s who had stepped in to help raise Chloe and her brother. Martha usually possessed the strict, unshakable voice of a seasoned matriarch, a woman who had weathered decades of poverty with stoic grace. But when Chloe answered the phone, the voice on the other end was trembling so violently it was almost unrecognizable. "Chloe, oh my sweet girl, are you sitting down?" Aunt Martha wept, the sound a chaotic mix of heavy sobs and joyous laughter. "The hospital just called me. The surgery. The valve replacement was a complete success. Your father's heart is beating strong, baby. He's sleeping in a private VIP suite like a king." Chloe covered her mouth with her trembling hand, tears immediately blurring her vision. "And Jamal," Martha continued, her voice cracking with overwhelming emotion. "Your brother just came sprinting through the front door. He got an email. A full academic scholarship, Chloe. 4 years, completely paid for by some anonymous charitable trust. We're saved. The debt is gone. We're finally free." Chloe could hear 18-year-old Jamal cheering and crying in the background, his youthful voice echoing with a bright, unburdened future. A heavy, beautiful sob tore from Chloe's throat. She whispered words of love to her family, promising to visit the hospital the second she left the building, and slowly hung up the phone. She sat in the quiet penthouse, wiping her face, completely overwhelmed. Slowly, she lifted her tear-streaked face and looked at Julian. The cold, calculating CEO who terrorized boardrooms was watching her with a quiet, profound warmth, completely hidden behind his usual icy facade. She knew Vanguard's dummy corporations, the VIP suite, the anonymous trust. It wasn't a miracle of the universe. It was him. "I don't know how I can ever repay you," Chloe whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my family. You saved everything." Julian leaned forward, his expression serious but deeply gentle. "You saved my company, Chloe. And more importantly, you reminded me that there are still things in this world worth protecting." He reached forward and opened the black leather folio resting on the glass table. Inside was a stack of crisp, watermarked corporate documents. "Your internship is officially terminated as of this afternoon," Julian said smoothly. Chloe blinked, momentarily confused, before Julian slid a gold Mont Blanc pen across the table. Because interns do not have the security clearance required for the position of special financial assistant to the CEO. Chloe looked down at the contract. Her eyes widened as she read the bold print. It was a permanent, full-time executive staff position, but it was the compensation package that made her heart stop. The salary listed was an astronomical figure, a sum so high it felt like a typographical error. It was enough money to move her family out of the South Side, to buy a real home, to never have to eat dry bread in a stairwell ever again. Mr. Vance.
"Julian," Chloe stammered, pulling her hands back as if the contract were hot. "I can't sign this. I'm 20 years old. I haven't even finished my degree yet. I don't have the MBA, the experience, the pedigree. I'm not perfect for this job. I haven't earned this kind of money." Julian did not smile. He looked at her with a fierce, uncompromising respect that rooted her to the spot. "I have a building filled with MBAs and Ivy League pedigrees," Julian said, his voice echoing with absolute certainty. Marcus Thorne had the best pedigree in Chicago, and he used it to steal millions. Degrees can be bought. Experience can be taught. He pushed the gold pen closer to her hand.
"I don't pay for perfection, Chloe. I pay for incorruptible integrity. You stood in the dark, desperate and broken, with a fortune at your fingertips, and you chose to walk away. You stood in a boardroom of wolves and didn't blink. That is a rare, priceless commodity. Sign the contract, Miss Davis. You have more than earned it." With trembling fingers and a heart full of soaring, uncontainable hope, Chloe picked up the pen and signed her name on the dotted line. A week later, the harsh Chicago winter had begun to thaw, the morning sun reflecting brightly off the soaring glass facade of Vanguard Innovations. The bustling lobby was a sea of tailored suits and rapid footsteps, but one figure stood out with a quiet, undeniable presence. Chloe Davis walked through the revolving glass doors. She was no longer wearing the faded second-hand blazer or the worn-out canvas sneakers. She wore a sharply tailored professional charcoal suit and sleek, polished leather heels that clicked confidently against the marble floor. Her signature dark, curly hair was swept back and secured in an immaculate, elegant bun that framed her striking, intelligent face. She carried herself not as a timid, frightened intern, but as a woman who had faced the darkest temptations of the corporate world and emerged completely victorious. She swiped her new, gold-trimmed executive access badge, striding purposefully toward the private elevators. Far above her, on the penthouse level, Julian Vance stood with his hands in his pockets, looking down through the floor-to-ceiling glass. He watched his new special financial assistant cross the lobby. As she stepped into the elevator, Julian allowed a genuine, relaxed smile to spread across his face. The cold, mechanical world he had built suddenly felt a little warmer, a little brighter. It was the beginning of a formidable professional partnership, built on a foundation of absolute trust, and as he turned back to his desk to prepare for the day, he knew deep down it was the start of something incredibly promising. And so we reach the end of the journey for Chloe. The greatest lesson we can take away from this story is that true integrity is what you do when you think nobody is watching. In our everyday lives, we might not stumble upon an open safe full of cash, but every single day we are faced with quiet choices. It could be returning extra change to a cashier or simply choosing to tell the truth when a lie would be much easier to say. This story reminds us that our character is the only thing in this world that truly belongs to us. When you hold on to your morals, even in your darkest and most desperate moments, life has a beautiful way of rewarding you. If this story touched your heart today, please share it with your friends and family to spread this message of hope and honesty. Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts on the journey of Chloe. And please subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring stories like this one. May God bless you and your family abundantly. May He give you the strength to always choose the right path, even when it is the hardest one to take. If you believe that honesty and faith will always bring the right reward, in the end, please type Amen in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening and have a wonderful day.